learners at college from our service and an alumna of St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. She was awarded her MA and PhD degrees by the Department of English, University of Calcutta. She professes an avid interest in British literature of the 18th century, partition studies, resistance literature, popular culture, as well as miscellaneous Indian writings in English, Bengali, Hindi, and English translation. Her research articles have been published by Journal of Commonwealth and Postcolonial Studies, Georgia Southern University, USA, Cambridge Scholars Publishing, University of Calcutta, Vidyasagar University, University of Burdwan, as well as Netaji Subhash Open University, LitCrit, and Cafe de Census, among others. So she is going to give us a talk on partition literature, and it is going to be about um, literature in translation, primarily partition literature, which have been in translation, and she's going to begin the talk. And so over to you, Debasri, and very, very warm welcome to Barashat Government College. But before that, since we are recording and we are so happy, I just hope nothing happens to it. The point is, the recording credit goes to Kalna General Degree College. Dr. Krishnendu Doctor, who is very generously has offered this platform to us, which is why we can record this talk. So thanks to him, and Debasri, we are waiting for your talk.
Okay, thank you, Shatibi, for such an elaborate introduction. And well, obviously, I'm very delighted to meet you, your departmental colleagues, some of whom I already know, and also make acquaintance with others. And of course, dear students, good afternoon to all of you. As Professor Shati Mittur has already informed you, I'll be speaking on Indian partition literature in translation. Here I would like to make a qualification that the term Indian implies not just what we know as India currently, but the entire Indian subcontinent. Perhaps more precisely, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I have prepared a slideshow for you all because some of the things that I will say may not be very familiar to you. So let me start sharing my screen, and hopefully things will become a bit more easier for you to understand. Okay? Is it visible? Just let me know.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. As you can see, I have framed the title of today's presentation as Indian Partition Literature in Translation and Appraisal. Obviously, it's going to be just a short overview of what we know as Indian partition literature in translation over the last 7 decades since the mid-1940s. Now, before moving on to partition literature, I suppose some of you might require a brief introduction to what partition is. I suppose, partition in Bengali we know it as Desh Bhag. In Hindi and Urdu, it's known as Batwara. These terms are familiar to most of us, if not all. But even so, I do think you need to know something about the historical background to the partition. Some of it is definitely included in the school textbooks, but not all. So here I would like to tell you of how this very momentous division, which took place in August 1947, affected a substantial populace of the subcontinent for the next few decades. And it continued so, especially for Bengal, our own region, even till the 1970s. This is because when the liberation war was being fought in Bangladesh, we once again had what we know as the second partition, and Bengal had to bear its brunt because huge number of refugees were streaming across the international border, and obviously there were repercussions on both sides. Now, moving on. See, the thing is that you have to remember something. By partition literature, we imply not just any formal writing which has been published, even informal memoirs, essays, some of it which are still perhaps in unpublished form, let's say in manuscript form. They too will be included under this broader ambit of partition literature. And since we are talking of partition literature in translation, I would also like to speak on how some of these works have been translated, and yet there are, I mean, a huge number of texts still remain untranslated to this day, which is why their effect, their readership still remains quite confined only to that linguistic region. Now, moving on. Here I have included a map of India as it was in 1947, prior to the partition. You can see certain arrows which point to the movement of refugees and evacuees across the border. Of course, this map is not according to any particular Survey of India parameters. It's just for representational purposes. You can see the mainland India, West Pakistan on the western sector, East Pakistan on the eastern sector. This is currently known as Bangladesh. I told you, Bangladesh came into existence only in 1971. Prior to that, it was East Pakistan. And then we had the princely states of Hyderabad, Kashmir, and Junagadh. Coming to the next slide. Now, as some of you might know, the partition led to unprecedented violence. The death toll, according to some estimates, reached as far as 2 million. I hope you understand the enormity of the number, 2 million, 20 lakhs. And still, I mean, these are all unofficial figures. I mean, it's not verified, so it could be even more. And as far as the refugee influx is concerned, we still do not have the exact figures because many of it was not actually recorded. So while some figures peg it at 15 million, sometimes it's 16 million, and you have to remember something. The refugee problem was a lingering effect of the partition, especially on the eastern sector of the subcontinent. Why? Because Bengal had a porous border, unlike the west, where it was heavily guarded and the population exchange took place. So after 1948, there wasn't much movement of refugees across the western border. Unlike the east, where it continued till the 1970s, and especially after certain untoward incidents in Bangladesh in the 1990s and in 2000, 2001, there have been reports of once again some influx of refugees across the border. And as I've said, the Bengal border is not as well guarded as the western sector, which is why this problem still continues. Maybe it has lessened to a considerable extent nowadays, but we cannot ignore the cumulative effect of this huge refugee influx, especially as far as we Bengalis are concerned. Now moving on to partition literature. As I was saying, that partition literature includes a wide range of literary genres. You have partition novels, partition short stories, partition poems, even drama, and of course memoirs, as I've already said. Now of these, uh, we are more familiar with partition novels and partition stories. Partition poetry has been written, though not to such a great extent as fiction, that is novels and short stories. But yes, some poetry has been written, and a few have also been translated into English. As far as drama is concerned, I have come across only a couple of dramas which incidentally were written in English. I'm yet to come across dramas which were written in the vernaculars and were later on converted into English in a way. Because you see, while in Bengali we do have certain plays which were written in the early 1950s. I can perhaps give you an example of Chinnamool, but not all of them have actually been translated into English and published as a separate piece of work. And this is something which I'll come back to towards the end of my lecture today, when I emphasize the need for further translation of these untranslated works. I mean, it's a huge mine. And as students and scholars of partition, perhaps we definitely need to pay more attention to these unexplored areas and bring them to the light. Now, I'll be coming to your syllabus. Of course, I won't be teaching the texts that you have in your partition paper. That's for Shati madam and the other teachers of the department. They will take care of these texts. But I just want to go through the texts that you have in your syllabus, the West Bengal State University syllabus, which incidentally follows closely the UGC prescribed syllabus. Where you will find that you have some poems. One of them is I Shall Return to This Bengal, written by the famed Bengali poet Shivananda Das. It was translated by Shukanto Chaudhuri, who is an eminent professor and also a translator. Then we have the poem Toba Tek Singh, written by Gulzar, the well-known Hindi and Urdu poet. Perhaps most of you know Gulzar better as a lyricist and a movie director rather than a writer. But let me assure you, Gulzar is one of the better known writers of partition literature. In fact, he has an entire short story anthology specifically devoted to partition writings. And here he has written a poem, Toba Texing, which incidentally is the title of another very well-known short story written by Sadat Hossain Manto. We'll come to that later. This particular poem, Toba Texing, has been translated by Anisur Rahman. Then you have three short stories. The first is Alam's Own House. It's a Bengali short story written by Dipendu Palin. The original Bengali title is Alamer Nijer Bari. It has been, excuse me, translated by Sarika Chaudhuri, who some of you might know, is a professor at Center for Studies in Social Science, Patuli. Then you have The Final Solution, written by Manik Bandopadhyay and translated by Rani Roy. The original Bengali title is Shomosya Puran. Okay. Now, incidentally, this particular story is also a part of the partition syllabus at CU. The college where I teach is under CU, is affiliated to CU, and The Final Solution is a part of the syllabus there as well, though not the other texts. And then we come to the short story I mentioned just a minute back, Toba Texing, written by perhaps the greatest of Urdu partition writers, Sadat Hossain Manto. I mean, he is the best known across the continent and even in Western academic circles. Perhaps one reason being he has been the most widely translated. This particular short story has been translated by Muhammad Asauddin. He is a scholar. He is a professor. He is a translator. He has edited books, and as I was saying, I mean, he is best known for his scholastic works on partition. He's presently stationed in Delhi. He works there at one of the Delhi universities, but he is originally from Assam. So you do know that uh, just like people in West Bengal, people in Assam were also somewhat affected by the partition. Of course, not as uh, enormously as people in Bengal, but definitely Assam too had to absorb some of the refugee influx from East Pakistan. So, I mean, being from there does give Muhammad Asaduddin a certain context, which I'm sure did help him in his later partition studies. And finally, coming to the partition novel that you have in your syllabus, apart from Train to Pakistan, which is written in English, so it's not a translated work, you have Basti, which is written by Intizar Hussain, another very well-known Urdu writer of partition literature. This particular novel was translated into English by Frances Pritchett, and she also has, translated Urdu works for many years. She's an American, but she has devoted the major part of her academic career towards the translation of various Urdu texts, including Basti. Now, Basti is a Urdu term. Uh, it, if you have to translate roughly into English, it would mean something of a settlement. Okay, not necessarily what we in common parlance mean by Basti. Most people in Basti would regard the word Basti as a slum, but no, in Urdu it doesn't mean slum. In Urdu it means settlement. From you have to understand there are minor uh, variations as far as connotations of certain words. So what we Bengalis know as Basti is different from what the Urdu-speaking people would know as Basti. And this is just for your clarification. Now, moving on to the next slide. Excuse me. Here, I would like to point out that a from reading the texts which are prescribed in your partition paper, if any of you profess an interest in this field, you can explore some other important works in this area. Of course, nowadays you are hard pressed for time. I know you have your semester exams, but after your semester exams, when you have a bit of a time before your results are declared, if you are interested, I'll definitely advise you to go through some of these works. Especially the novels and the short stories, which won't really take more than 2-3 days to complete. I mean, they are not very long novels. And nowadays, many of them are quite easily available on the internet, so you can definitely have a look and get to know more about this particular topic. Now, coming on to the other partition works which are quite well known across the subcontinent and which thankfully have been translated into English, which is why people from other regions too can read them. As you know, India is a multilingual country, and translation is the only medium to have a sampling of works written in other languages. Translation also serves a very important purpose, that it makes a particular work accessible to people in other countries, not just other regions of India, but also in other countries. And this is vital, especially when we come to actual propagation of a particular work and its popularity. But then that's something which I'll come to towards the last part of my lecture. Here, let me go through some of. Yes,
Debasri,
Shanti.
just give me 1 minute, because I think I have been logged out of the main part, so the recording has stopped. Just could you
Okay,
give me
definitely.
2 minutes
Yes.
before I
No
join back?
issues.
Yes.
No, okay. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat box, and I will definitely try to respond to them once the lecture is over, once I have completed the presentation. I hope some of you are at least finding these aspects of partition literature interesting. I know it's something of an acquired taste. Not many of you might suddenly like literature because, as I may say, it's not something very likable. These are tales of woe and suffering and misery. Uh, in fact, I would say partition literature is difficult. Difficult not in the sense that they are difficult to understand, but I mean, they're difficult to read, and they can really leave a person with a very heavy heart, really pondering on the unspeakable harm and injury that had befallen on these people. And some of them still continue to suffer, because I suppose all of you are aware of the term trauma. And, trauma can be really long lasting. It doesn't get over in just they remember those harrowing experiences that they had at the time of the partition.
Okay, I think we've got it back.
Okay. So let me resume the slideshow. Now, first I'll be talking about Hindi partition novels in translation. Uh, there's a very well-known novel named Jhoota Sach. I suppose most of us do understand uh, Hindi. Jhoot means falsity, and such is truth. So there's an inherent paradox in the title itself, Jhoota Sach. Now, one might wonder what could be the meaning of course, the translated work, the English version has been titled "This Is Not That Dawn," which incidentally is a line from another poem. But let me get back to Jhuta Sach. Basically, uh, some of you might be aware that the Communist Party of India actually called the Indian independence something of a falsity because it did not really achieve the desired effect. Their slogan was "Ye Azadi Jhuta Hai." Ye Azadi Jhuta Hai. That means the independence, the freedom that people have supposedly achieved. It's just an eyewash. No actual freedom has been attained by the people. It's just political freedom on pen and paper because most people have suffered and their situation has not improved one jot because of this so-called political freedom gained in August 1947. Okay. Now, perhaps Yashpal is the author of this particular novel. He was influenced by this communist struggle and this slogan, which became quite popular in that day, "Ye Azadi Jhuta Hai," which is why he gave this particular title to his partition novel, Jhuta Sach. It was a fact that India did get independent, and yet it didn't quite translate into anything significant or anything substantial for the people of the country because large sections either died or they were uh, definitely turned penniless. They became refugees and they had to be at the mercy of the host country, be it India or the two wings of Pakistan. So this is the feeling, the impression then that one gets from reading the novel Jhuta Sach by Yashpal. It was translated into English by Anand. Then we come to another very well-known work. Uh, Perhaps more people know of Tamas than Jhuta Sach. Tamas is a Sanskrit word which implies darkness. I suppose some of you are aware of a certain Sanskrit shlok, Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya. Tamas is darkness. In Bengali, we know it as Andhokar. Now, Tamas was written in the mid 1970s. Uh, and it became very widely circulated. It was originally written in Hindi by Bhisham Sahani. Now, Bhisham Sahani is also another very well-known literature. I mean, he is also the younger brother of Balraj Sahani, the great Hindi movie actor. Bhisham Sahani had experienced the partition riots because he was originally from what we nowadays know as Pakistan. At the time of partition, it was West Pakistan. Nowadays, it's just Pakistan. There were riots even in 1926, prior to the actual partition riots in 1947. So Sani had been a witness to even those riots of 1926, and then also, once again, the Lahore riots of 1947. The Lahore riots took place in March 1947, even prior to August, the official month of March. Now, later on, Tamas was translated into English by Jayaratan. Now, Jayaratan is a very well-known translator of Hindi works into English. Now, you will find I have mentioned two other names here apart from Jayaratan, Hisham Sahni and Daisy Rockwell. Why? Because Tamas is a work which has been translated not once or twice, but actually thrice, three times. Now, one may wonder, I mean, what was the need for the same work to be translated three times by three different translators? here we come to some of the problems and issues related to the process of translation. As you know, translation is something very subjective. It's not machine translation, which can be objective. And unfortunately, machine translation has not yet succeeded. I'm sure most of you have had some very funny experiences with Google Translator, right? If you type out something and Google translates it, and it comes out as totally comical. So as of now, we still have to rely on people, manual translation. Computers haven't really reached that stage of advancement when uh, they can do everything via software. So because Hisham Sani, the author, felt Jayaratan's version of Tamas was not quite very authoritative, in the sense that there were some areas lacking. He came up with his own version of Tamas. Now, since he was the writer himself, it is expected that, he must have brought out the perfect English version. But very recently, in the 21st century, an American scholar and translator, her name is Daisy Rockwell, she came up with yet another, a third version, English version of Tamas. So the question arises, does that mean that even Hisham Shani's version is not perfect? Here, of course, let me add, Daisy Rockwell has given an interview where she says that some of the areas needed a bit of tweaking, especially the English phrasings and the sentence structures, which is why she came up with this third translation. Now, there could be some truth to it, because for Daisy Rockwell, English is her first language, unlike Jayaratan and Hisham Sani and all of us here in India, for whom English is not really our first language. It's our second language. After all, English is a foreign language for most of us. The English is not the first language we learn as children. So this has been quite an interesting trajectory for Tamas as a translated piece, where we have three versions. Of course, it might be illuminating to make a comparative study of these three versions to find out how similar they are, and more importantly, how different they are, provided the person carrying out this study is also aware of Hindi, so that he can see the corresponding areas in the original Hindi novel as well. Okay. Now moving on to the next slide, that is Urdu and Punjabi partition novels. Okay. Now, the first name that comes to our mind is the Urdu novel Aag Ka Darya. It was written by Kurtalin Haidar. Now, Kurtalin Haidar has an interesting story. After the partition, she went to Pakistan, but then she felt that perhaps India was better. So later on, she came back to India. So here we have an instance of what is known as a reverse migration. Now, Kurtalin Haidar was quite well versed with both the languages Urdu and English. So later on, she herself translated her Urdu novel Aag Ka Darya into English, and she titled it as River of Fire. Okay. Then we have another partition novel, which is titled Udas Nursery. The author is Abdullah Hussain, and it was later on translated into English as The Weary Generations, and the translator is Azkar Nadeem Said. Now, incidentally, this particular novel is not concentrated only on the partition years. It actually starts after the First War of Indian Independence, that is after 1857, and then it stretches on to the actual Indian independence, that is the mid 20th century. So it covers a long duration of almost a century. Then we have a couple of Punjabi novels. The first is Now Te Maas. It was written by Kartar Singh Duggal. He is a joy of Punjabi literature. He has written, scores of novels and hundreds of short stories on the partition. In fact, he even has an anthology of partition short stories. It's titled Abducted Not and Other Stories of the Partition Holocaust. Now, Kartar Singh Duggal himself had a personal acquaintance of the refugee problem because, his wife, she was a physician and she was actually helping out the refugees in the refugee camps in North India. So he did witness the sufferings of these people. And being a Punjabi, he's originally from Pakistan. He came to India after the partition, and he did witness the widespread violence over there. And most of his works, they do touch upon that violence, not in very vivid details, but definitely there is an undertone of violence. At the same time, we do get to feel the pain of these characters who suffered so badly in the partition turmoil. So this particular novel, Now Te Maas, it's a Punjabi phrase. If you have to translate it literally, it basically means nails and flesh. Now is nails. In Bengali, we know it as nok. And mass is flesh. In Bengali, we call it mangsho. So the Bengali title would be something like nok ebong mangsho. But then when it was later on translated into English, it was translated as, the title given was Twice Born, Twice Dead. It's about a Punjabi young woman named Sadbharai who was abducted and then she changed hands. And there was also another young woman whose name was Rajkarni. So it's basically about these two women, Sadbharai and Rajkarni, and how they fared after the partition. And finally, we come to yet another Punjabi novel, which I'm sure some of you at least have heard of its name. It's a Pinjar. It's written by Amrita Pritam, and later on it was translated by the very well-known writer Khushwant Singh. You have Khushwant Singh's train to Pakistan in your syllabus, so I suppose you are familiar with his works. Pinju was translated as the skeleton. Basically, a lot of people take Pinjar as a cage. Now, this is not the exact meaning. Pinjar here implies the rib cage. In Bengali, we call it pajor. So how the communal violence can reduce someone to, just bones, a skeleton. That's the implication of the title. Now, the reason many of us know of Pinjar, even though we may not have read the text, is because of the movie, which was produced, I think, in the first decade of the 21st century. The director was, Chandra Prakash Dwivedi, and Urmila Matondkar had played the title role, and there was also Manoj Vajpayee. If you ever get a chance to watch that film, though, here let me specify something. The character of Huro, that is the character which Urmila Matondkar plays, she is not a victim of partition violence. Let me remind you that. She was abducted prior to the partition. So her abduction didn't have anything to do with the religious animosity as such. It was more because of a family feud. And in North India, unfortunately, in those days, family feuds were, I can't really use the word resolved, but that was the effect of family feuds. It went on because rapes and abductions were a very common occurrence. Uh, I thought I should mention it here because a lot of people have the impression that Huro was a victim of the partition violence. She was not. Her sister-in-law she of course was a victim of partition violence in the sense that she was abducted at the time of partition. But Kuro herself becomes a victim of the family feud which her family has with the family of the man who actually abducts her, Rashida. Okay. Um, Kuro, I think Pincher, the movie is available online, so do watch it. It's a well-made movie, very sensitively portrayed. I suppose you can relate to the pain and misery of a woman who has been abducted, and even her own family rejects her when she finally manages to escape. So that's a double blow for her. And sadly, this was the fate suffered by many women, and not just in North India, but even in our very own Bengal. We Bengalis, sometimes we pride ourselves on our liberal mindedness, on our progressiveness, but we too didn't really fare very well. Not all of us could show the generosity of heart and mind when women were concerned. Now, let me go to the next slide. Here finally, we'll be coming to Bengali partition works, that is Bengali partition novels in translation. Here, the first novel that comes to our mind is Epar Ganga, Opar Ganga. It was written by Jyotirmoy Devi and published in the 1960s. Later on, it was translated into English by Inaki Chatterjee, and the English translation was The River Churning. Now, this reminds me, Inaki Chatterjee unfortunately passed away just a few days back. Um, Yet another victim of this COVID-19 pandemic. She was not just a prolific writer herself. I mean, some of you may have read of her stories as well. I remember reading some of her stories which were published in Bangla Puja Varshikis when I was younger. And at the same time, she is also responsible for translating many Bengali works into English. In fact, two of these works I have mentioned in my slide as well. The first is Epar Ganga, Upar Ganga. It's about a young woman, Shutara Dotto, who has a very traumatic experience during the Partition riots. It's not specified whether she was abducted or she faced sexual assault. That is left a bit hazy, but the main emphasis is on how she fares once she comes to West Bengal and is totally at the mercy of her extended family. As I was saying, we Bengalis, we couldn't really show our kindness to these women who had to face the brunt of the partition violence, despite our famed education and liberal mindedness. So that's something that really should provoke our thoughts. And I mean, we should introspect on what went wrong, that we couldn't rise up to the occasion and extend a compassionate hand and be more empathetic towards them, not just sympathetic, but empathetic. Moving on, the next partition novel that I've mentioned is one by Sunil Gangopadhyay. Now, most of you know of Sunil Gangopadhyay. He's, a very well-known and very popular writer. As students, I'm sure you have read his Kaka Babu and Shontu novels. Now, Sunil Gangopadhyay wrote two novels which had to do with the partition and refugees. The first is Purva Poschim. It was translated as East West, once again by Inaki Chatterjee. Excuse me. And then there's another novel, Arjun. This is focused on the refugee problem. Arjun is one such refugee who has to take shelter in the outskirts of the city of Kolkata after the partition. This particular novel was translated by Chitrita Banerjee Abdullah. Then there's yet another novel, which is a much recent one. It's titled Doyamoi Kotha. It was written by Shunanda Shikdar. Now, some of you might know Shunanda Shikdar. Of course, she is a writer, and there's also another identity of her. She is the wife of a very well-known Bengali partition scholar. Um, I think some of you might have read of certain essays written by her husband, Mr. Shikdar. Now, of course, since we are talking of fiction here, I'm not going into that. Let's stick to Doraemon Kotha, which was translated into English by Onsita Thoto. This is a much more recent development, and thankfully now more such Bengali works are being translated into English, because, as I've said, I mean, Bengal still has a huge gamut of such works to offer, and because of lack of translation, not many beyond our state lines know about these works. Next slide. Now that we have covered novels, let's go to the next literary genre, that is short stories. And obviously, the very first name that comes here is Urdu. I mean, Urdu short stories, Urdu partition short stories are the best known across the Indian subcontinent and also in international circles. Once again, the reason being Sadat Hasan Manju and the fact that his works have been extensively translated into English and, of course, other languages as well. So we have stories like Holdo, which was translated more than once. One of the titles was Open It. Then we have another title which is Reunion. These are basically English versions of this same Urdu short story, Holdo. Then there's the short story Thanda Gosht, which also has been translated more than once. Of course, the literal meaning is cold meat, but here the cold meat implies not just the fact that a body turns cold when we die, but if you read the story, you will learn how the coldness of a corpse can really affect even a so-called warm-blooded man. It can leave him traumatized. So this story is more about trauma and the effect of trauma on a man incidentally. So it's a bit different from other stories where we see it's really the women who are the traumatized characters because they have had to face, they had to face either rape or abduction or such ordeal. But here, Chanda Ghosh by Sadat Hasan Manju is a story where we get to see man suffering because of the trauma. So if you ever get a chance to read it, I mean, as I've said, many of these works are nowadays available online free, so you can definitely have a look. Then there's the story, A Tale of 1947, which is about a mother and a daughter, and once again, it's about abduction. Then there's a story, Sahai. Sahai is actually a character in this short story. He is a pimp, and yet he sacrifices his life so that he can uh, save the money of the prostitutes working under him from being robbed. He dies in a mugging incident, but he manages to save the money. And later on, he is successful in giving that money before bleeding his life. So it talks of a supreme sacrifice of a pimp. Then we have Mosul, who is basically a Jewish girl. Now this story is interesting because it presents Jews, a community which was not directly involved in the riots between the Muslims and the non-Muslims, that is the Hindus and the Sikhs. So the Jews were a third party, and yet we find this girl, a Jewish girl, Mosul, in Bombay, laying down her life for her Sikh lover. Then there's yet another famous story, The Dog of Titwal. Now, this is a partition story in the sense that it talks of the repercussions, the aftermath of the partition, and how people, uh, their lives have become totally absurd. Uh, Soldiers guarding the frontier across the international border, and how it can be quite a dehumanizing experience for both parties, both camps, not just the Indian side or only the Pakistani side. So that's the impression that we get after reading this story, The Dog of Titwal. The original Urdu title is Titwal Ka Kutta. So these are some of the partition stories written by Siddharth Hasan Pancho. You have Toba Singh in your syllabus, so you will read about Toba Singh. So I'm not mentioning it here. I've already mentioned it in your syllabus slide. Now coming to Intezar Hussain, you are reading a novel by Intezar Hussain, Basti. Incidentally, he has written a number of short stories on partition as well. Some of them are, the English title is An Unwritten Epic. The original Urdu title is Ek Bin Likhi Razmiya. Once again, it's about a man named Pichwa, who eventually dies a rather tragic death in modern day UP after the partition, because his situation has completely reversed once the partition took place. Then we have a very famous story, A Letter from India, Hindustan Se Ek Khat. It's about a family, some of whose members have migrated to West Pakistan, whereas the remaining members have continued in India. So this particular letter is from one such family member living in India to his relative living in West Pakistan. Then we have the story Shahre Afsos. In English, it has been translated as The City of Sorrow. Now, this is a rather surrealistic story. You get people running frantically across the streets in nighttime and all because of the violence. You can't really take the events in this story very literally. They are symbolic. And as I've said, they leave you with a very eerie sensation of what violence can really do to a person's society. If a person actually goes quite disoriented after undergoing such an ordeal. And then there's another Urdu story, More Nama, which has been translated as A Chronicle of the Peacocks. As you know, the Hindi and the Urdu word for peacock is Mo, and Nama is a saga, chronicle. Just like you have Zindagi Nama, okay? Akbar Nama, similarly, More Nama. Now, this story is more about the impact of partition over the next few decades rather than 1947 in particular. And definitely, I would advise you to read this particular story because it gives a very good idea of the literary capability of Intezar Hussain. He encompasses a huge, I would say, range in this particular story, starting from the age of the Buddha to the current age, and it's very relevant to all inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, not just the Indians, but even people in Pakistan. I'm sure they can relate to this particular story. Incidentally, Intezar Hussain did move to Pakistan, like Sadat Hussain Manto, after the partition. So he became a Pakistani citizen, and yet you see most of his stories written even after partition. They do have Indian characters, and in many cases, even the setting is India. So it's a fact that he couldn't really get over India, though he physically did migrate to Pakistan. So that's the long-term impact of such a division. While the physical separation has taken place for some, especially the sensitive-minded, the past still holds a very strong, control over such men and women. Moving on to the next slide, which is Hindi partition stories in translation. Once again, we have Bhushan Sahni. We already talked of Bhushan Sahni when I was talking of Hindi novels, Tamas. We have here another very well-known story. The original Hindi title is Amritsar Aa Gaya Hai. This story, incidentally, has also been translated more than once. I've given one of the English titles here. We have arrived in Amritsar. It's about a train journey from West Pakistan to Amritsar in India. As you know, Amritsar is just across the Indian border. And how the dynamics amongst the train passengers change when the train enters a different country. That is, the religious minorities in one country become the religious majority in a different country, and that totally changes their body language, their behavior towards others, and so it's all basically psychological. Then we have another well-known story written by Krishna Sobati. This is the original Hindi title is Sikka Badal Gaya. Sikka, as all of you know, is a coin, and it has been translated into English once again by Daisy Rockwell. I told you about Daisy Rockwell when we were discussing Tamas. Now, Daisy Rockwell has translated Sikka Badal Gaya as the currency has changed. You know, along with the partition, even the currency changed. So it was now the Indian rupee and the Pakistani rupee. You know, it's rupee in both the countries, even till now. But we call it INR, Indian rupee, whereas in Pakistan it's the Pakistani rupee. So how the currency can change just because of a political division. And then another well-known Hindi writer, Sachinananda Hirananda Bachchan, he had the pen name of Agya. He had written a short story titled Sharandata. It was translated into English as The Refuge, where the story talks of how even neighbors can turn into enemies because of this partition. Here we have the protagonist, Devendra Lalji, who seeks refuge at the house of his next door neighbor. And the neighbor initially is very welcoming. He says, you need not worry, you will be safe there. And yet later on, Devendra Lal realizes that the neighbor is out there to actually poison him to death. So that is the moment of revelation, so to speak, for him. And he realizes that interpersonal relationships have irrevocably been changed, and there's no way of going back to the pre-partition bond harmony. So this is the Sharantata. And it's true of other regions as well, how sometimes neighbors actually turned against a person, you know, and brought to the mobs. So this is true in part even in Bengal, especially in Eastern Bengal, where majority of the riots took place. Now coming to Bengali partition short stories in translations. After all, we are from Bengal, so our main focus should be on Bengali stories. Now, you have the story, The Final Solution by Manik Bandyopadhyay. The original Bengali title is Samossha Puran. Now, the story I have mentioned in this slide, Dupul Hara by Pratibha Basu, can be regarded as some sort of foil, a complementary story to Samossha Puran. Why? Because the initial situation of the characters is almost same. I mean, both are women-centric stories. Refugee women coming from Eastern Bengal, East Pakistan to India, first Shialda station, and then to the outskirts of the city. And yet, because of their different circumstances, they meet completely different ends. So, Dupul Hara can be treated as a foil to the story that you have in your syllabus, Samossha Puran. If you have the time, I would definitely advise all of you to read Dupul Hara. It's been translated twice into English. One title is The Marooned and the other title is Flotsam and Jetsam. Do read it and you will understand how luck, how fate can make such a significant difference to one's life, despite the fact that both the sets of characters are refugees. And while in Shamosha Puran, the protagonist got lucky. Of course, she also showed some courage. We cannot pin it down totally to luck. She was also bold. She took a certain risk, certain chances, which unfortunately was not the case in Dukul Hara, where the protagonists were too timid. They couldn't really put up much of a resistance. And yet, we find these characters meeting a very grim end towards the end of this short story. Then once again we have Jyotirmoyi Devi. I've already told you about Jyotirmoyi Devi when I was talking of Bengali partition novels, Epar Ganga, Upar Ganga. Now there's this story, Shei Cheleta. It has been translated as That Beggar Boy. Now it's a Bengali story, but it's set in Delhi. And in a way, it is slightly, related to what happens to Epar Ganga. Upar Ganga's protagonist Shutara Dotto later on, because she moves to Delhi after her education. Now here also we find a refugee woman with a boy. The protagonist recognizes the refugee woman as her mother who had been abducted, but not the boy. And then eventually she comes to this shocking realization that the boy is actually her own half brother. The boy is a product of the partition violence. The mother was raped, and that's how this boy was conceived. Sadly, this was the fate of many women in North India as well as in the eastern part of the subcontinent. But the question arises is whether these women later on, when they do get to meet their erstwhile families, how are they treated? Are they accepted with open arms, or there is an outright rejection? Unfortunately, in most cases, the family members simply refuse to recognize. Acceptance is a far cry, and the notions of so-called bodily purity and pollution, they take the upper hand, influencing such decisions. And of course, we know the Indian subcontinent is out and out patriarchal, and we get to see the ill effects of such a patriarchal mindset in these stories, be it Upar Ganga, Epar Ganga, Upar Ganga, or even Shei Cheleta by Jyotirmoyi Devi. Now, incidentally, Jyotirmoyi Devi was also she had witnessed the partition, and then her daughter was involved in the partition rehabilitation efforts. Her daughter's name is Ashoka Gupta. So the entire family, they were very much involved with the refugee resettlement, rehabilitation, and they had witnessed the grim side of partition firsthand, and it definitely found a reflection in the literary works of Jyotirmoyi Devi. Now, there's another story which I've mentioned in my slide. It's written by Narendranath Mitra. Now, incidentally, Narendranath Mitra is a prolific Bengali writer. I mean, firstly, perhaps some of you are aware of his name. If any of you have watched the movie Mahanagor by Satyajit Ray, it was created by Satyajit Ray, you will know that the refugee problem arising out of the partition, that engages Narendranath Mitra in many of his stories. Because if you remember, the protagonist of Mahanagor, the character played by Madhavi Mukhopadhyay, she's a woman from a refugee family. I mean, and that's the reason why she had to go out on door-to-door selling as a saleswoman because of her financial conditions. Now, the story I have mentioned here is particularly striking. The title is Joibo, and it has been translated as biological. Just in the previous story, I talked of how partition violence had resulted in a number of pregnancies, some of which even resulted in childbirth. Now, Joibo is about one such woman who had faced rape, and the husband was a scientist. And even after she was later on rescued, the husband actually studies her. She's treated almost like a guinea pig in a lab and how we all know guinea pigs and white mouse are used in labs to conduct experiments. The husband also treats his wife uh, not with love and affection and empathy and tries to make her feel comfortable at home. Instead, he treats her as a guinea pig, as a specimen to study how the circumstances surrounding the conception of a zygote. It results in the birth of the child and how that child grows up. So it's basically part of an experiment. So, it almost borders on the dystopian. How something so cruel uh, that has already befallen this woman is still not the end of the story. She still has to face, even further ignominy at the hand of her husband. Not because he has rejected her, but because he is now treating the wife as a lab rat, nothing more than that. Now that we have talked about Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu, and Bengali writings. Let me come to a language which has been little discussed in partition literature studies. This is Sindhi. Now we forget that Sindh in its entirety went to Pakistan. Unlike Punjab or Bengal, which were at least partitioned, so we did have West Bengal. Punjabis had the Eastern Punjab. But the Sindhis, the Hindu Sindhis, they didn't have any part of Sindh. So the entire Hindu Sindhi community had to migrate en masse, and they spread to different western Indian states like Maharashtra, like Gujarat, like Rajasthan. So their pain is even more acute than Punjabis and Bengalis because they no longer have any part of their homeland today, the Sindhi Hindus. So um, this part is not so often discussed in most partition studies. So in the year 2009, Rita Kothari came up with an anthology. It was titled Unbordered Memories, Sindhi Stories of Partition. She compiled around 24 stories. She herself translated them from Sindhi to English. And I'll just mention a few names from this story. One of those stories is The Neighbor by Sheikh Ayaz. I talked of how the neighbors could turn against neighbors. Now, this is one such case where a neighbor almost feels tempted to strike against his Hindu neighbor because he had read that Muslims were being persecuted in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. But then at the last moment, good sense prevails on him and he decides to save his neighbor, Jesus' mother. So it definitely ends on an optimistic note. Then we have another short story titled The Uprooted by Vishnu Bhatia. And as the very title suggests, it's about the refugee problem, how people were totally uprooted from their native places and had to grow root in a foreign land. I mean, for these, I mean, they have never really come to what we now know as India. So it was foreign for them, despite, I mean, being the same religious affiliation. I mean, no other part of India had the Sindhi, so it was virtually borderland for them. And then we have yet another short story titled The Claim, written by Naran Bharti. Now, some of you might know refugees after coming to India had to fill out claims for their properties left in either East Pakistan or West Pakistan. Here we find a man who comes to the office to fill out his claim, and yet he feels that no amount of monetary compensation can be enough because he has lost his land, the smell of his land, the soil on which he and his family had lived for generations. So that is something which is irreparable. It cannot be brought back, no matter how much of the amount he receives from the government. So that pain really comes through in this particular story, The Claim by Nara and Bharti. Now, The next slide is about poetry. Of course, novels and short stories form the major part of partition literature in translation. But some poems have also been translated into English. You have two or three of them in your syllabus, two of them, I believe. Now, some other poems written by Sahir Ludhiani. Now, Sahir Ludhiani is a well-known name. He is a very well-known as a lyricist of Hindi movies. Now, he was basically an Urdu writer. So, there's the poem 26 January, which he had written and which was later on translated into English. Then I already talked about Amrita Pritam in the context of Pinjar. Now, Amrita Pritam had also written a Punjabi poem which was later on translated into English, and the first line was "I say unto Waris Shah." Now, Waris Shah is a seer of Punjab, and he was respected and revered both by Hindus and Muslims of Punjab. So, uh, this particular poem actually views the fact that the syncretic culture propagated by people like Waris Shah, who was something of a seer, a Sufi, that no longer exists. It has been destroyed because of the partition violence. Then we have After Death, 20 Years. This is a Bengali poem which was written by Virendra Chattopadhyay. The English translation is After Death, 20 Years. And then we have Shankho Ghosh. All of you know Shankho Ghosh. Once again, just like Enaki Chattopadhyay, he too passed away recently because of the COVID-19 pandemic. He has written a number of works pertaining to the partition, and one of his poems, which it has been translated into English as rehabilitation. I hope all of you know the meaning of rehabilitation. Punarvasan. Okay. Now, I'll just very quickly go through these slides. Partition literature in translation. It came into being only from the 1990s. And all of you know that 1997, it was the golden jubilee of the Indian partition. And that's when publishing houses really picked it up. They started bringing out all these short story anthologies where you had stories from different parts of India written in the various vernaculars being translated into English. And since then, it has become quite a popular publishing trend. But there is something to be noticed in these initial anthologies, which came up in the 1990s. The linguistic representation is not uniform. I'll just, give you a very brief outline of these anthologies. We find that most of them are centered on North India. That is, you have stories originally written in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi. Very few from Bengal, Sindh, almost non-existent. So is Sylhet. I suppose you do know that Sylhet was also a part which, after the Sylhet referendum, went to East Pakistan. But many Bengalis lived there, so they too had to move either to West Bengal, but most of them actually moved to Shilchar area, the Barak Valley of Assam. Okay. I'll just tell you of how skewed this representation is. Alok Bhalla's partition anthology, it had around 58 stories, but of them only was 8 or 10 were actually from Bengal, that is Bengali stories translated into English. And then similarly, we had other anthologies where Bengali stories had a very nominal presence. In some anthologies, there was not even one single short story, Bengali partition short story. Example would be the one edited by Professor Mushirul Hassan. He is again another eminent partition scholar. At one point of time, he was also the vice chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia. That's a university in Delhi. Now, this led to the impression that Bengal doesn't really have much partition literature. I'll just quote a line from the editors of a volume. It was titled Pangs of Partition, where with two editors, S. Sattar and Indira Baptista Gupta, they say, An interesting, this is a quotation, and here I quote, an interesting aspect of Bengali literature is its total indifference to partition, as virtually no short stories or novels of significance deal with it, unquote. This is from page 11 of their book. Now, this book was published in the year 2002, that is the first decade of the 21st century. So can you imagine? And this is not the saying of any layman, someone who has no idea about partition writings. Two scholars, and I mean, they are scholars in their own right. They are quite well known in academia. They are making such a categorical statement regarding the absence, the so-called absence of Bengali partition short stories or novels. Now, this basically leads us to question, why is that? I mean, why does this impression prevail that there are no significant Bengali parts? Simply because we Bengalis, I suppose, are to be blamed for that. We haven't really taken up the initiative that was required to translate all the novels and the short stories and the poems that have been written on the partition into other languages, most importantly English, so that it has the maximum readership. And that's why even our fellow Indians have little to no idea of Bengali partition literature. I'm leaving out the Western audience. I mean, for the West, the Indian partition starts and ends with Punjab. Very few of them actually mention Bengal. So I think it's the responsibility of us to, take it up on a war footing and publish as many, translate as many works, and then see to that they are published. As I was saying that Valla's original copy, it has actually 63 stories, 47 of which were from these other North Indian languages. So you see how Bengal was sidelined. Then Orphans of the Storm, this was edited by Kartar Singh Duggal. I told you he himself is a very well-known writer from Punjab, and Saroz Pawasji. Now, it did not have any single story either from Bengal or from Sindh. See, you can see how uneven the linguistic distribution was. That's the reason. So, thankfully, in the recent years, many Bengali partition anthologies have come up, and this incidentally started with 2002, the year when Prafulla Roy published his English version of Bengali partition stories. The English translation was done by an Australian. His name was John W. Hood. He's a scholar of Bengali literature. For many years, he has even lived in Bengal, and he translates Bengali writings both from West Bengal as well as from Bangladesh. So this particular anthology, titled Set at Odds, Stories of the Partition and Beyond, it came out in that very same year, 2002, when Gupta Baptista made that infamous statement. Then the next year, 2003, we had The Trauma and the Triumph, the Gender and Partition in Eastern India, which included some writings in English translation, though not many. Basically, it was not just a short story anthology, it also included critical essays on the topic. Now, the most, voluminous book on this subject is obviously Bengal Partition Stories, an Unclosed Chapter. It was collated by Bashavi Fraser. She is a scholar currently living in Scotland, Edinburgh, and she should definitely deserve. She deserves praise from all of us for managing to bring out that huge volume. But then, as the title tells us, unclosed chapter. So it's not closed yet. There's still that is left to be done. Then we have another very interesting anthology, Map Making, Partition Stories from Two Bengals, collected by Devjani Sengupta, now which includes a story from Tripura. Now you have to remember, Bengali refugees from East Pakistan and East Bengal, they moved mostly to West Bengal, some to Assam, but also others to Tripura. and some of the other northeastern states like Meghalaya, Shillong to be specific. So we have a story in this particular anthology from Tripura. So once again, it's entirely Devjani Sengupta's credit that she has painstakingly collected these stories from both the East Bengal as well, that is modern day Bangladesh, and from these regions where the Bengali refugees migrated after partition. And so you have 6 stories from Indian part of Bengal, or where Bengalis moved to after the independence and partition, and East Pakistan and modern day Bangladesh. So 6-6. So it's a very equal representation. Total 12. I was talking of how some Bengali refugees went to Assam. Now, as I've said, these Sylheti refugees were also unheard of in most of the earlier partition anthologies. So, in uh, 2012, we have this particular collection, Barbed Wire Fence, Stories of Displacement from the Borak Valley of Assam. It was edited by Nirmal Kanti Bhattacharya and Dipendra Das. They are both scholars, professors of English, and they have, taken up this important project to show how Bengalis who are not settled in West Bengal have to face the brunt of the locals as well. I suppose you do know of how there's some internal friction between the native Assamese and the refugee Bengalis, and even last year, it did create quite a bit of turmoil in the city of Guwahati. There were movements and demonstrations. So you do know the relations between these linguistic groups are not always very harmonious. So the Bengalis over there have to face the I would say the double bind of first leaving their homes and coming to India, and then facing violence from the local Assamese people. It's definitely an unenviable situation for them. Now, as I was saying, our region is still very much a treasure trove of Bengali partition writings, and only some of these texts have been translated. Some of the other works which require translation, I'll just go through the names very quickly. These are very well-known Bengali novels. Bokultala PL Camp. PL means permanent liability. Bokultala PL Camp. This novel was written by Narayan Sannal. Then Kya Pata Noko by Prafulla Roy. I suppose some of you are aware of the TV serial which was based on Prafulla Roy's novel, Kya Pata Noko. It was showed on Zee Bangla a few years ago. Then we have Nilkantha Pakhir Khoje, another Bengali novel written by Atin Bandopadhyay. Then in 2003, there was this novel Bishak Brikho written by Mihir Sengupta, and it had won the Anand Puroskar as well. It has been translated interestingly into Hindi, but not yet English. So obviously the first step has been taken, but as we all know, English has a much wider readership. So it would definitely benefit the novel if it's translated into English. And we already talked of Shankha Ghosh in the context of poetry. Now, Shankha Ghosh had also a partition novel titled The Shupuri Boner Shari. Now, incidentally, this work has been translated into English, but it hasn't been formally published. It has been translated into English by Musarraf Hussain Khan. He is a scholar. He is also founder of the Cafe de Census web magazine, and thankfully his version is available on the internet. So if any of you are interested, you can perhaps access it. He hasn't yet published it in book form. Okay? Hopefully once it gets published, it will have a wider reach. Now, we are coming to the last part of my presentation. I've talked extensively how it's only translation which can enable these works to reach not just people belonging to other regions of our own country and the Indian subcontinent, but also other parts of the world. But translation is a very tricky process. Already I told you of how the Thomas novel, the Hindi novel, it was translated thrice because I mean, none of the versions seemed adequate or satisfactory. Now, what happens is that, as I've said, a translation is a subjective process. So sometimes it happens that a particular translate a particular word or phrase in a one word, and another reader might think that no, this is not the correct phrase that has been used. So he or she comes up with a separate translation of his or her own. Uh, Now, this is an actual problem, and here I would like to mention one particular story, a Bengali story titled Aro Duti Mrityu. It was written by the Bangladeshi writer Hasan Hafizur Rahman. It's part of his anthology, which is also titled Aro Duti Mrityu. Now, this story has been translated twice into English. First by Nia Zaman. She's a Bangladeshi professor of literature. She edited the Partition anthology, The Escape and Other Stories of 1947, where she translated it as uh, two more deaths. And later on, Devjani Sengupta, I also mentioned about Devjani Sengupta when I was talking of map making. She translated this particular story as Deaths on the Night Train. And if you ever get to read the original and both these versions, I have incidentally read the Bengali version as well as these two English versions. I was, really struck by the huge difference in the three versions. Um, I'll just mention one point. Devjani Sengupta's version is not quite complete. She actually leaves out almost a page and a half from the Bengali original and leaves the story open-ended. Now, while that may create some sort of a suspense and leave the readers wondering what happens, if you ask me personally, it becomes a slightly different story. So, as a translators, I think we owe it to the author, the original author, that we shouldn't take too much liberties and try to stick as far as possible to the original version. Of course, the translation studies is a different aspect. We have different kinds of translation. Some are literal, some are liberal. But because these are not just any fictional stories, but these are partition stories in the sense that they do have a historical basis. So it is perhaps preferable if these stories remain faithful to the original version. So that finally brings me to the end of my slideshow, and also, I mean, I have tried to, provide you with some sort of a very brief overview of partition literature in translation. Of course, a lot of it I couldn't simply touch because of paucity of time. Still, I think I have exceeded the time. By almost, it's all past 1:30 p.m. It's lunchtime, Sunday noon, so I know most of you would be, eager to have your lunch. So perhaps it's time for me to end it here. If you have any questions, you can definitely ask.
Students, any question? Thank you, Debasri. That was such a wonderful paper and a talk. I think you have mapped it not briefly, but you've done a huge job, like absolutely mapping a canon which is spreading across the entire subcontinent. And you have taken the students into the regions and introduced them to the tropes and leitmotifs, that the recurring tropes that the partition writers have been using, and you underlined the why partition literature needs to be translated. I think that is how you kind of drew our attention, and all of us as students here, because we know so little about partition literature. So you drew our attention to this particular need to translate that should encourage students to think what they possibly can do. And incidentally, you also observed, your observation also touched for us, the Department of English, a course which we are not offering because of the pandemic, translation studies, and the need for
Okay.
translation studies in India, the very, very relevance of it. But
Yes,
that
yes.
is, that is just to my observation and putting your huge thing into context. I do hope there is at least one or two observation from students. If they have anything to add to it, say to what you had to say, that would always be nice. So especially sem 6, you are exposed to partition literature, you are doing partition literature. Is there anything you want to say, any observation that you would like to make? And don't let me ask by name, that would be uncomfortable.
No, 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 don't
No,
force
no,
them. If
they can.
later
Because,
on,
you know, they are, oh,
Ma'am,
Farjana is
oh,
going to
there's
say
someone.
something.
I
Yes,
see. Okay.
Farjana is going to say something.
ম্যাম একটা কোশ্চেন ছিল যে দুকুলহারা যে দুটো নাম দ্য মেরুন অ্যান্ড ফ্লোটসাম অ্যান্ড জেটসাম এটা কেন একটু যদি বলেন
Shono. If I say in Bengali, or perhaps do all of you understand Bengali, or is there someone who is not a Bengali?
They are
Let
all
me.
Bengalis here.
Oh, okay, okay, fine. দেখো, অরিজিনাল বাংলা গল্পটির নাম হলো দুকুলহারা, কিন্তু যেটা আমি বললাম এটা দুবার ট্রান্সলেটেড হয়েছে, দুটো আলাদা আলাদা অনুবাদ। একটার টাইটেল দেওয়া হয়েছে দ্য মারুন, অল অফ ইউ নো মারুন মিনস স্ট্র্যান্ডেড উইথ নো ওয়ান এলস টু হেল্প, এবং অন্যটা টাইটেল হচ্ছে ফ্লোটসাম অ্যান্ড জেটসাম। এটার মানেও কিন্তু ওই মানে যাদের কোনো গতি নেই, যাদের কেউ দেখার নেই, হ্যাপলেস বেসিক্যালি। এবং তোমরা যদি গল্পটা পড়ে দেখো দেখবে যে it's about a refugee woman, her mother-in-law and her two daughters, and by the end of the story either they die or they become victims of prostitution gangs. Unfortunately, this is another aspect which happened in large numbers in Bengal, in Punjab. Refugee women were lured with the hopes of being offered help, and then, they were imprisoned and turned to prostitution. So, coming back to your original question, Farzana, because these are two separate versions, দুটো আলাদা ইংরেজি ভার্সন, এবং যিনি অনুবাদক তার উপরে নির্ভর করে সে কি টাইটেল দেবে। তো এই ক্ষেত্রে একজন টাইটেলটা দিয়েছেন দ্য মারুট এবং অন্যজন দিয়েছেন ফ্লোটসাম অ্যান্ড জেটসাম। ফ্লোটসাম অ্যান্ড জেটসাম incidentally is the title given by the translator, which is part of Devjani Sengupta's anthology, Mathematic. Okay? And the Maroon is a part of the anthology which has been translated, and actually it has been edited by one of our CU professors, Professor Tapati Gupta. Shakidi, Tapati di এই বইটা edit করেছেন. It has come out from Onushtup. So you also have Anil Acharya as the co-editor. মেরুন যে গল্পটা ওই অ্যান্থোলজির মধ্যে ইনক্লুডেড, আর ফ্লোটসাম এন্ড জেটসাম হলো দেবযানী সেনগুপ্ত ম্যাথমেটিক এই অ্যান্থোলজি। দুটো আলাদা ইংলিশ ট্রান্সলেশন, তাই জন্য টাইটেল দুটো আলাদা।
ওকে ম্যাম, থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম।
Labuni has a question. Labuni, you can ask your question. Labuni?
Yes, ma'am. I have no question, ma'am, but I am feeling much interested in partition literature after this talk. It is very fruitful, ma'am.
Okay, I'm glad to know that. At least some of you have, developed an interest in this topic. Believe me, as Shatidi already knows, I mean, we know each other for the last 1 decade. It has been an all-consuming study for me. I haven't ventured into any other field since then, even after completing my PhD, because I still believe a lot of it remains unexplored. So although I have written my PhD dissertation, I'm still a student of partition studies, and I hope to continue it in the future as well. Now I have another question by Rimpa Ghosh. Why Thomas's name kites will fly when it's translated in English? Okay, see, as I have said, sometimes the English title is not the literal translation of the word. Like in another case, the Punjabi novel by Kartar Singh Duggal, Naute Mas, the literal translation would be nails and flesh, but the English translation is twice born, twice dead. Over here, kites will fly. It actually means when there is any riot. Okay. You know, dead bodies lying strewn all around. So you have vultures and kites, birds of prey, looming on the sky. So kites will fly is basically a reference to that sort of scenario when corpses lie all over and there's no proper disposal. So many people have died. So there's no way proper funeral can be offered to these corpses, and their only fate is to be consumed by these birds of prey, kites and vultures. So, Rimpa, is the meaning clear to you now? Kites will fly?
And
Yes, ma'am.
as
Thank
far as
you.
I remember, it is a phrase which one of them say in the novel, like यहाँ पर चीले उड़ेंगे, something
Exactly.
like that, which they say before the moment they say there's going to be the partition. I don't remember which character, but they do say Chile Urenge, which means that there is going to be so
Kites
much
will,
death
yes,
around. And we are in
exactly.
the middle of Chile Urenge and Chile Urre. So we do know that.
Unfortunately,
Yes,
yes,
in
the
a completely
pandemic,
different
pandemic,
situation. Yes, yes.
yes.
Unfortunate incident. Deblisha, you have a question.
Yes, Devlisha Malik. Reading the translation, the essence of the true text is lost. We are unable to get the true flavor of the language in which it's been written. Can you suggest something? How can we not feel so? Read translation and yet get the essence of the original text. Hmm. Well, unfortunately, Devlisha, I cannot offer you a ready answer because the only way to bypass is to read it in the original, which is virtually impossible. I mean, we are not polyglots. We are not P.V. Narasimha Rao who knew, excuse me, 14 languages, so he could perhaps read all these texts in their originals. So we'll have to rely on translations. I thankfully have lived outside West Bengal and I've studied Hindi. So that gives me an edge in the sense that I can read the Hindi text in original. But I don't know Urdu, which is why I have to rely on the translated versions for Urdu texts and Sindhi texts. Um, for us, the best we can hope is the translated version is an authoritative version. And thankfully nowadays we are getting multiple versions. So if someone, you know, is interested, as I said, one can go for a comparative analysis of the different translated versions of the same story. Even if you don't know the original language, if you go through two versions of the same story, perhaps you can do some sort of an experiment with the final solution which you have in your syllabus and Dukul Hara. You can study the two translated versions of this story, either Protsam and Jatsam or the Maroon. And then you will yourself detect even some minor differences between the two. That will give you some idea of what not what the original Bengali text was if you don't have the Bengali text at hand, but still it will give you an area that this is something which is not categorical in the sense that it varies in the two different versions of the text. So you know that it's an area which might be slightly problematic, which is why it posed certain difficulties for the translator, and why that's why the two translators came up with the different versions of that corresponding section in the original version. Okay, so Deblish, as I have said, I mean, the only way to get the actual feel of the work, be it a novel or a short story, is to learn the original language. But I know that's easier said than done. So the best you can do is rely on the translated version. If there are multiple versions of that same text, you can do some sort of a analysis, a comparison, a compare and contrast of the two versions to find out whether they are the same or they are slightly different. That's all. And
Yeah.
it's a difficult and a highly problematic area. And that's why translation studies has nowadays become so important.
But it's nice that we have a lot of audio books nowadays. I
Uh,
particularly ask them to go through or listen to the audio versions where they actually read out in the Urdu and the Hindi form in this Hindi. At least the Urdu, the Manto and
Hindi obviously is understandable thanks to Hindi movies, but Urdu, you know, not all words
but
may be
yes,
understood
they're
by.
millennium children. They haven't watched the kind of Hindi movies we have watched. So, I, so yes, for them it would be a little difficult. But even they was a year for a little young. But the kind of Urdu films that we had to watch, like the Hindi films, which kind of came under Urdu primarily, uh, that had a lot of Urdu, and much of it is understood. It is just maybe a couple of words here and there where you are faltering, and you have to look up the meaning. But
Yes, yes.
the basic
Obviously, you
flow
have to
and the
take the
mood,
help of those dictionaries. Nowadays, of course,
yeah, yeah,
even these dictionaries
absolutely,
are available online, so it has
yeah,
become definitely much easier for us to make sense of
absolutely.
these words in other languages.
Hey, Ambarish, we will close the day. Ambarish,
Yes, আমি আছি
yes,
এখন কে
আর
who
কেউ
will give the
প্রশ্ন
vote of
করবে?
thanks,
Yes.
whether it's me or anybody else.
No, it's going to be you. It's going to be you. Amrish, একদম
Okay,
সেজে গুজে এসছে. Yes, so nice. Yes.
okay.
হ্যাঁ.
So we are at the fag end of a very inspiring and very illuminating session, and Professor Basu's talk reminds me of my PhD days when I was also studying working on the partition literature, particularly not exactly the partition literature, but the working of the subaltern, the migration, the displacement of people, and all these things.
Okay.
And in doing so, I had studied so many texts that you have mentioned, and so many texts that I have not yet studied. So, our lecture actually inspired us, actually enriched us, and of course, our students, needless to say. So, while listening to her, actually, we forgot the time winged chariot is hurrying near. So, because of the paucity of time, she has to finish. And indeed, our thanks and our respect goes to her for her precious time that she has given us and enriched us with so many shades of translation literature, particularly in the partition area. Because what she has mentioned in discussing the partition literature, that there are so many things that still remained unexplored.
Yes.
And still it is something that the working and studies are still going on, but still the sunlight still falls on the broken column. And one thing is that the journey that has started with Khushwant Singh's train to Pakistan, the story of the misery of Lajbanti, the story of Chaman Nahal's Azadi, where Lala Kashiram starts his journey and ends in a refugee camp from his beloved motherland, Sialkot, and ends in Delhi. So the journey that starts has not come to an end and will never come to an end. And the journey will still go on for the exploration of this partition. And the bar that has flown away the journey will go on in search of this bird, সেই নীলকণ্ঠ পাখির খোঁজে, that will never come to an end. And the trauma that has been created by the bifurcation of this country still has not been recuperated, has not been repaired. So once again, our cordial thanks to her, and we are indeed enriched. And also thanks to our respected colleagues in the department, Professor Debjani Roy Maulik, Professor Swati Mitra, Professor Priyanka Sen, and Professor Debapratim Chakraborty, who are all collaborated in organizing this program. And also our beloved students, who particularly the same 6 students, and I think some of SEM 4 and 2 are also there. They are also enriched, and SEM 6 students have learned a lot regarding the translation in the partition literature. So hope it will help them in studying the partition selected texts in this area. And also I'd like to thank Kalna College for their assistance in recording the session. So hope this session, Professor Basu will give us more lectures if we ask her in future. So with this, my vote of thanks, I would like to conclude my vote of thanks, and hope expect to learn much more from her in this regard, in this partition literature. And the books that she has mentioned, which I myself have not yet read, I would like to read, and I to know much more on this particular topic, because whenever we read history, we find, like Selim Sinai, that our hand is mysteriously handcuffed to it. So with this, once again, my hearty thanks to everybody. I'd finish this thing, and I would like to quote one beautiful line from the Bengali text, Kotha ko onadir otit, to talk about this partition literature. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody, and especially thanks to Professor Basu once again. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words, Professor Amurishan. I do hope to meet you in person as well as your other department colleagues. I've already met Shakidi and Devjani, but I'm yet to meet Priyanka, you, and Debaputi. Hopefully the pandemic subsides soon and we get to meet in some seminar or some such other.
Hope we will come out of the situation. Yes. In the near future.
In the meantime, all of us, let's hope to stay safe and healthy and take things in our stride as far as possible.
Thank you, Debasri. Thank you so very much.
Okay, Swati, thanks to you. I could give this lecture. Incidentally, this is the first time that I'm speaking on partition literature to college students, apart from, of course, my own college. I have given an invited lecture, but that was on a different topic to set of college students. But well, partition studies is my area, and well, I definitely need to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my studies, my experience with the students, because after all, students are our future. Hopefully some of these students will get inspired to take up studies, and perhaps even, you never know, translate a few Bengali pieces to English, and
absolutely,
that's how the chain goes on.
Absolutely.